A racist principal expels a black student, assuming she's just another troublemaker. He mocks her, belittles her, and sends her packing without a second thought. But when the student calmly reveals who her father is, the principal freezes. The man who thought he had all the power now stands in shock as his own career begins to unravel. You won't believe what happens next as the tables turn and karma hits hard. Keep watching to see how this moment changes everything for both the principal and the student. The atmosphere at Westbrook High School was always one of rigid tradition, a place where students from wealthy families were expected to behave, excel, and embody the school's prestige. It was a place where success was measured by the number of honors students, and where appearances were often valued more than character. The principal, Mr. Collins, was a man who lived by the rules, as rigid as they came. His beliefs were unwavering, and his actions were often defined by a strict adherence to what he believed was proper behavior. Unfortunately, this came at the expense of understanding the diverse backgrounds of his students. In his mind, there were the good kids, those who came from well-established families, who were dressed in expensive clothes and always followed the rules. And then there were others, those who didn't fit the mold. He had long since formed opinions about these students, assuming that their behavior and actions were often tied to their backgrounds, dismissing them as troublemakers before they even had a chance. Amidst this environment of conformity and prestige, there was Maria, a black student who had quietly proven herself to be an excellent student. She was respectful, polite, and always did her work. She had a quiet confidence and a sense of calm that often made her blend into the background. Despite being a top student, Maria had always felt like she didn't quite fit in with the rest of the school. Her modest clothing, humble background, and polite nature seemed to be at odds with the flashy, status-driven culture of Westbrook. But Maria had never minded. She knew who she was, and she was determined to make her way on her own terms. She had earned her place at the school through sheer merit, even if the principal and some of the other students couldn't see beyond her outward appearance. Today, however, things were different. When Maria entered the school office, she had no idea that her quiet, steady path through high school was about to be completely derailed by a series of events set into motion by a simple misunderstanding. The principal, Mr. Collins, had made assumptions about her based on his biased views, and now those assumptions were about to lead to an injustice that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Maria stood outside the principal's office, her palms slightly sweaty, as she waited for her turn. She had received a call earlier that day that her presence was required due to a disciplinary matter, but Maria couldn't fathom what it might be. She had always been respectful, following the rules and staying out of trouble. Her teachers loved her work ethic, and her grades reflected the hard work she put in. Yet here she was, summoned to the office for something she hadn't even done. She took a deep breath before stepping inside the office, where Principal Collins was sitting at his large mahogany desk, his face unreadable. As she entered, he barely looked up from his papers, his expression giving nothing away. The room smelled of formaldehyde and old leather, a reflection of the traditional, unyielding nature of the school. "Sit down, Maria," he said, his tone cold and clipped, not giving her the usual polite greeting he reserved for other students. She took the seat opposite him, her heart pounding as she tried to keep her nerves under control. "I've called you here because there's been an incident involving your behavior," Principal Collins began, his words sharp and deliberate. "I've received reports that you've been disrespectful to other students and that you've been causing a disruption during class." Maria was taken aback. "I haven't done anything wrong, sir," she replied, her voice steady, but laced with confusion. "I haven't been disruptive in class. I've always done my work and tried to keep to myself." Principal Collins finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "That may be your version of the story, but we've had complaints, Maria. People are talking. They say you've been difficult to work with and that you don't fit in here." His voice dripped with condescension, as though he was speaking to someone who didn't understand the weight of his words. Maria's stomach twisted as she heard the implications in his voice. It wasn't just about a small incident. It was about her presence, and the assumptions that had been made about her. "Do you realize, Maria, how important it is to behave in a way that reflects the values of this school?" he continued. "Westbrook High has a reputation to uphold, and it's not the place for students like you. I think it's time for you to leave." Maria felt a sharp pang in her chest as the principal's words hit her. He wasn't just talking about one incident. He was making an accusation based on something much deeper. He was dismissing her based on his perception of who she was and her background. "Sir," she started, her voice trembling slightly now, "I have worked hard to be here. I've followed the rules, I've respected everyone, and I've done everything that's expected of me. I don't understand why you're saying this." Principal Collins leaned back in his chair, looking at her as if she were an annoyance. "You clearly don't get it. I don't have time for students who don't understand the importance of fitting in with the school's standards. If you want to be successful, you need to learn that, Mariah. But for now, I'm afraid your presence here isn't welcome anymore." The words hung heavy in the air as Maria fought to keep her composure. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All her hard work, her dedication, none of it seemed to matter to him. It was clear that the principal wasn't concerned with her achievements, but with her appearance and his preconceived notions about who belonged at Westbrook. "Please," Maria said quietly, "I haven't done anything wrong. I don't deserve this." She knew there was no use trying to convince him. His mind was already made up. But as she sat there, the weight of the injustice became unbearable. Principal Collins leaned forward, picking up a letter from his desk and pushing it toward her. "Take this," he said dismissively. "It's your expulsion notice. You'll be out of here by the end of the day." Maria's hands trembled as she took the letter. She didn't know whether to cry or scream, but she refused to let him see the pain in her eyes. Instead, she stood up slowly, gripping the letter in her hands. "I won't forget this, sir," she said quietly. Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the office, the weight of the moment heavy on her shoulders. As she walked down the hallway, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. She wasn't just being punished for a small mistake. She was being punished for existing in a place that didn't believe she deserved to be there. But Maria wasn't the kind of person to let this kind of injustice define her. The seed of determination had already been planted, and it wouldn't be long before she would prove to Principal Collins just how wrong he was. Maria had left the principal's office in a daze, her hands clutching the expulsion letter tightly. The weight of the injustice pressed down on her chest, but there was a fire burning inside her, a quiet, determined anger. She wasn't going to let this man's prejudice take away everything she had worked for. The more she thought about it, the more the injustice of it all stung. He had based his decision on nothing more than assumptions about who she was and where she came from. As she walked through the hallways, her mind raced, but her steps were steady. She passed by classmates who had watched the confrontation with wide eyes, whispering behind their hands. Some were sympathetic, some were indifferent, but most were just too afraid to stand up for what was right. Maria paused for a moment, leaning against a locker to collect herself. She wasn't just going to walk out of the school and accept this as her fate. She had her father to consider, her proud, hard-working father, who had always taught her the value of perseverance and standing up for what's right. She couldn't just let this go. Just as Maria stood there, gathering the courage to figure out her next move, a figure approached her from behind. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her father's voice cut through the quiet hall, warm but firm. "Maria, I heard what happened," he said, his tone calm, but with an edge that Maria knew meant he was already forming a plan of action. Her father, Marcus Davis, was a highly respected figure in the city, an influential businessman who had built his career from the ground up. Known for his integrity and leadership, he had always taught Maria the importance of fairness and standing up for injustice. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," Maria said, her voice filled with frustration. "I didn't know what else to do. He wouldn't listen to me. Don't apologize, Maria. This isn't your fault." Her father interrupted, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "He crossed a line today, and we're going to make sure he understands the consequences." Maria looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want to just be expelled and forgotten. I want him to know what he did to me and how wrong he was." Her father nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "We'll make sure he learns exactly who you are and who your family is. You don't need to fight this battle alone." Within moments, Marcus had already begun to make phone calls. As a man who had earned his place at the top, he knew exactly who to call and what to say. His reputation, coupled with his strong network of influential contacts, meant that things could change swiftly when he spoke up. Maria's mind was still racing, but she knew that what her father was doing would bring change. No one would be able to ignore the power dynamics of this situation once it was out in the open. The principal's actions had consequences, and the world would soon see just how far-reaching those consequences would be. Just an hour later, Maria and her father walked into Principal Collins's office. The principal, who had been smugly thinking he had gotten away with his discriminatory actions, was completely caught off guard. When he saw Maria enter the room with her father, his expression faltered. The atmosphere in the office shifted dramatically as the realization dawned on him. Marcus stood tall, exuding confidence and authority. He was a man who had worked his entire life to build something meaningful, and now, standing before the principal, it was clear that the school's unfair treatment of his daughter was about to backfire. "Principal Collins," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had more influence than the principal could have imagined. "I'm Marcus Davis. I'm the father of Maria Davis, the student you just expelled." The principal blinked, still trying to grasp the situation. I wasn't aware you were—" "Of course you weren't," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "Because if you had, you would have thought twice before treating my daughter like she was worthless. You would have known that my daughter isn't someone you simply dismiss based on your prejudices." Maria stood silently by her father's side, watching as the principal stammered, trying to formulate a response. The moment of his realization had finally arrived, and he was now struggling to maintain his composure. I had no idea, sir. I thought your daughter was— I didn't think she was fitting in here. I was only—" the principal began to say, his voice faltering. "Only what?" Marcus cut in. "Only judging her based on her appearance, on assumptions about her background? You assumed she wasn't worthy of the same respect as the other students, didn't you?" The principal's face flushed with a mix of panic and embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't cut it," Marcus said, Your actions today were not just a mistake. They were a result of your own biases, and there are consequences for that." Maria felt a sense of relief wash over her as she watched her father handle the situation with such calm authority. It was evident that the power had shifted in the room. Principal Collins's arrogance and authority had crumbled under the weight of truth and fairness. "I expect my daughter to be reinstated immediately," Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with authority. "And I expect a formal apology. If this matter is not resolved, I will take it further. This is not just about her. It's about making sure no other student here has to face the same kind of treatment." The principal, now thoroughly rattled, realized he had no choice but to comply. His career, reputation, and position in the school system were all at risk. What had seemed like an easy victory against a single student had turned into a public relations nightmare. The following morning, the school's administration office buzzed with activity. Rumors about Maria's expulsion had spread quickly through the hallways. Some students whispered in shock, others in disbelief. They had seen Maria as a model student, quiet, smart, respectful, and yet here she was, being unjustly expelled for reasons that had nothing to do with her actions. The injustice was palpable, and some students began questioning the system they were in. Meanwhile, Principal Collins sat at his desk, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had tried to justify his actions, but deep down, he knew that the truth was undeniable. Maria was right, and he had made a grave mistake by assuming she didn't belong. Now, there was no escaping the consequences. He could feel the heat from both the school board and the community building. As he sat waiting for the inevitable, the door to his office creaked open. He glanced up, expecting to see one of the other administrators, or perhaps a colleague, but to his shock, it was Maria and her father. The principal's stomach dropped as he looked at Marcus Davis, who stepped into the room with a calm, deliberate confidence that seemed to fill the entire space. Marcus's presence alone was enough to make anyone feel like they were in the presence of someone far more powerful than themselves, and it was clear that he was no longer the man the principal could manipulate or dismiss. "I trust we can resolve this matter now," Marcus began, his voice smooth and controlled. "I assume you've had time to reflect on your actions, Mr. Collins," the principal stammered, his face turning red as he opened his mouth to speak. I've been trying to, but I didn't know, I didn't realize." "Let me be very clear, Mr. Collins," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm yet measured. "Your mistake wasn't just a matter of misjudgment. It was a reflection of your prejudices that have no place in this school, let alone in a position of power like yours." Maria stood beside her father, her head held high, her eyes unwavering as she watched the principal squirm. It wasn't just the expulsion that mattered anymore. It was the fact that her father's influence, his presence, had immediately shifted the power dynamic. For the first time, the principal could feel the weight of his actions sinking in. He had made a decision that not only affected a student, but had potentially cost him his career, his position, and his reputation. "You didn't just expel my daughter. You attempted to shame her, to make her feel like she didn't belong here," Marcus continued, his gaze unflinching. "You assumed she was just another statistic, someone to be overlooked and discarded. But Maria has more strength, more integrity, and more intelligence than you could ever imagine." The principal's face grew paler with each passing second, the humiliation sinking deeper. His entire career was built on the premise of authority and control, but he was quickly realizing that those who operated from a place of fear and prejudice were always one step away from exposure. Maria had remained silent through much of this exchange, her composure never faltering. But now, with her father standing up for her, she felt a sense of power she hadn't felt before. It wasn't the power of revenge or humiliation. It was the power of knowing she had done nothing wrong, and that her truth, her quiet strength, was more than enough to stand against the lies and assumptions of others. "Here's the truth, Mr. Collins." Maria finally spoke, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I don't need anyone's validation to know that I belong. I've earned my place here, and I've earned every bit of respect I've received. You may have thought you could push me out because of who I am and how I look, but you were wrong. My father's name doesn't define me. I define myself, and that's something you'll never be able to take away." Her words hung in the air, and the principal sat frozen, not knowing how to respond. He had underestimated her from the start, and now he was the one on the defensive. His prejudice, his arrogance, and his inability to see beyond his narrow worldview had cost him far more than he could have imagined. The silence was thick as Marcus stepped forward, his voice colder now. "Maria will be reinstated immediately, and if there are any repercussions from your actions, rest assured I'll be involved in every single one of them. This is just the beginning for you, Mr. Collins." The principal's hands shook slightly as he fumbled with papers on his desk, trying to find the right words to apologize. But it was clear he had already lost the battle. His reputation would be forever tarnished by his own decisions. "Of course, Mr. Davis," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I will reinstate Maria right away. I'll ensure everything is corrected." Maria nodded, but her father didn't wait for more than a polite exchange. With a firm handshake, he turned and left the office, Maria by his side. The principal, left alone with his own humiliation, was now fully aware of the consequences of his actions. As the days passed, the fallout from the confrontation began to spread throughout the school, causing a ripple effect that reached far beyond Principal Collins's office. Maria's story became the center of attention, not just within the school, but within the community as well. The more people learned about what had happened, the more they realized how deeply ingrained prejudice and bias had affected the very heart of the institution they trusted. The school district was forced to take action. After an official investigation into Principal Collins's conduct, it became clear that his decision to expel Maria was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of biased and discriminatory behavior. Faculty members and staff who had overlooked or silently supported his actions were now under scrutiny. There were meetings, public apologies, and even promises of reform. Collins was suspended while the district reviewed his actions, and there was a clear message from the district's administration. Any form of discrimination would no longer be tolerated. For Maria, the reinstatement was swift, but it wasn't about her personal victory. She was relieved to be back at school, but she knew that her fight had sparked something much bigger. She didn't want to be a symbol of defiance. She simply wanted to be treated fairly and with respect, like every other student. But what she didn't know was how her story would inspire others who had been quietly suffering from similar biases. The day Maria returned to school, her classmates greeted her with a mixture of admiration and surprise. Some students, especially those who had witnessed the bullying and belittling she'd endured, came up to her to apologize, telling her how proud they were of her for standing up to injustice. Some teachers, who had once been passive in the face of Collins's authority, now stepped forward, offering their support and acknowledging that they had failed to see the problem when it was right in front of them. Maria wasn't interested in being a hero. She just wanted things to be better for everyone, not just herself. Her strength and dignity in the face of such injustice made others reflect on their own behaviors and prejudices. As the weeks went on, Maria saw more open conversations taking place about the biases that still existed within the school. Students of all races began to form an alliance, working together to make their voices heard and push for an environment where everyone was valued equally. Her father, Marcus Davis, remained a steady source of support. But he wasn't one to gloat about what had transpired. He wasn't proud of the conflict. He was proud of his daughter for showing the world that standing up for yourself and others was far more powerful than any status or wealth. He believed in creating change from the inside out, not from a place of anger or retribution. And, as Maria's father, he continued to guide her with the same wisdom and humility that had made him a successful, respected businessman. For Principal Collins, the aftermath was less forgiving. Despite the public apologies and the media coverage, the damage to his career was irreversible. His actions had exposed the deep flaws in his leadership, and no amount of remorse could change the fact that he had misjudged a student based on his own biases. The district's decision to suspend him ultimately led to his resignation, and he was never employed in an administrative role again. His once secure position had crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. Maria's journey didn't just stop at her expulsion and reinstatement. It marked the beginning of a much-needed conversation about systemic inequality, the importance of empathy, and how true leadership is measured not by one's position, but by the ability to uplift and respect others. As Maria continued her journey back to normalcy, the school started to change. Slowly but surely, conversations about bias and fairness became part of the curriculum, and teachers began to reevaluate their own biases, realizing how easy it was to overlook or dismiss students based on race or background. The student body had become more united, and Maria's experience had sparked a movement, however small, within the school. It wasn't just about a single student's victory. It was about a collective realization that justice, respect, and fairness should never be compromised. The principal's fall from grace had shown the power of accountability and the importance of acknowledging one's mistakes. In the face of his arrogance and the system's complicity, Maria had proven that standing up for what's right could not only challenge individuals, but also bring about real change in institutions. Maria's story wasn't just a reminder for her peers and teachers. It was a lesson for everyone watching. It reminded us that real change happens when people are brave enough to speak up, when they have the courage to stand against injustice, and when they do it not for personal gain, but for the betterment of all. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced bias or discrimination? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe to join a community of people who are committed to fairness, equality, and standing up for what's right. Let's continue to learn from each other and create a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more empowering stories.